you going to paint some minis?
Well, I was gonna try, but I don't know how.
If you're completely new to painting minis,
Like me.
then there are a few things that you can do before you start painting that'll make your models look even better. The first thing you need to do is pick which mini you're going to paint. If you picked a mini from a board game, chances are it came assembled. If it didn't, however,
It probably is on a sprue, like this.
you're going to need to remove the pieces from the sprue and assemble it yourself. To start, I had Victoria remove the pieces she needed from the sprue using a pair of clippers.
I followed the instructions to figure out which pieces I needed to cut.
I find that it's best to leave a little bit of the sprue when clipping to ensure you don't damage the mini. Once the required pieces have been removed, use a hobby knife to clean up the bits left over from the sprue. You can cut off the larger bits on your cutting mat and use the back of your hobby knife to gently scrape away anything that's left, smoothing out the surfaces the best you can. You can use a piece of fine grit sandpaper to help get a smooth surface if you wish. Minis that come pre-assembled won't have bits of sprue to clean up, but like unassembled minis, they may have visible mold lines that you want to remove. Gently scrape the mold lines off using the back of your hobby knife to get the mini nice and clean. Once the pieces are all cleaned up, check to make sure that they fit together properly. If they don't, you may have more to clean up. If they do, you can move on to gluing. You only need a tiny amount of glue. Put a drop on something like a paper towel and apply it to the mini with a toothpick. Once you've glued everything together, you have a mini you're almost ready to paint. You'll find that some minis come from the factory with the mold release agent still on them.
And sometimes they'll be a little oily from the residue left in the fingertips.
Either way, you're going to want to wash the mini with warm, soapy water before moving on.
Use a small amount of dish soap on a toothbrush and gently scrub the mini to get everything off.
After you've assembled and washed your mini, you may find that there are gaps between the pieces where they didn't quite fit together.
Like mine.
If this is the case and you want to fix it up, you can use a two-part epoxy like green stuff or milliput to fill the gaps. Mix the epoxy as indicated by the manufacturer. In this case, green stuff is ready when it's completely green. Then use a tool such as a clay shaper or sculpting tool to press the epoxy into the gaps and smooth it out. Once you have the gaps filled to your liking, allow it time to harden before moving on to priming. Of all the things you can do to prepare your mini for painting, the most important is to prime it. Primer helps the paint adhere better to the mini. When priming with a spray can, you need to make sure the primer is mixed. You can help this process along by first filling a bowl with warm water and placing the can into the water for 5 to 10 minutes. Then, shake it as much as you can stand to, and then a little more. Mount your mini to something you can hold using double-sided tape or putty. The effectiveness and quality of the primer is going to depend on the weather, the humidity level, and the distance from which you spray. You don't want to prime outside when it's too hot, too cold, or too humid. Before you prime, you should take a moment to think about what you're painting and what colors you'll be using. With a black primer, you'll get darker colors. With a white primer, your colors will be brighter and more vibrant. Gray serves as a nice middle ground. You want to hold the spray can about a foot from your Mini. Never start spraying with the nozzle pointed right at your Mini because any paint that may have dried to the tip of the nozzle could ruin the nice clean surface that you just spent all that time fixing. Instead, start spraying off to the side and sweep the spray across the Mini, painting in short bursts. Don't simply hold the nozzle down and drench the Mini in primer. If you want to experiment with undershading, a method that gives you highlights and shadows before you even apply any paint, you can try a zenithal prime. Prime the Mini in black and then prime it again from directly above in white. This will make the topmost parts of the Mini lighter and the parts underneath darker, simulating the natural light from the sun. If you don't like relying on the weather to get your priming done, you can also prime your Minis using an airbrush. If you're just starting out, you probably don't own an airbrush, but let's go over it anyway. Prepare your airbrush by attaching the hose to the airbrush on one end and your compressor on the other. Set the PSI on your compressor using the suggested settings from the company who makes the primer you're using. I'm using Badger's Stynylrez primer and they suggest spraying at a PSI of 20 to 30. Add your primer to your airbrush's paint cup and spray from 4 to 6 inches away from the Mini. Make sure you have something behind the Mini so you don't get primer all over the place, and wear a respirator if you can. Most of the paints and primers we use are pretty safe, but I prefer not to inhale my paint and primer if I can avoid it. You can use something as simple as a cardboard box to spray into, or you can buy a portable spray booth like this one if you like. Just like with the spray can, you want to start spraying away from the Mini and move across the Mini in a sweeping motion. 2 or 3 thin coats will give you the coverage you're looking for.
I was a little intimidated by the airbrush at first, but I found it really easy to use. Of the 2 methods of priming that I tried, the airbrush was definitely my favorite.
Once the Mini is primed, set it aside to dry, and you're good to go. Now that your Mini is assembled, cleaned, and primed, you're ready to move on to painting. However, we're going to save that for another video.
If you're like me and you're completely new to this, I hope that you were able to learn something today.
If you did learn something, or if you have questions for either of us, leave a comment below. Subscribe to the channel before you leave so you don't miss part 2. And as always, thanks for watching.
See you next time.